The morning sky above Britain trembled with the roar of 1,000 dragons. Squadron leader Jonathan Blackwood pressed his leather-gloved hand against the vibrating cockpit of his Supermarine, feeling the Merlin engines pulse beneath his palm like a war drum calling to battle. Through the Perspex canopy, he watched the horizon darken not with storm clouds, but with the approaching swarm of Luftwaffe bombers and fighters that would forever change the course of history on this fateful day of August 15th. Dragon leader to all Dragon Knights. Blackwood's voice crackled through the radio, his call sign echoing across the frequencies that connected the scattered squadrons of the Royal Air Force. Bandits approaching from the southeast. Vector 2. Angels 20,000. The Battle of Britain had raged for weeks, but today would mark what historians would later call Eagle Day, the German Reich's most concentrated aerial assault on British soil, as referenced in Winston Churchill's wartime speeches, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives. The Prime Minister had declared that upon this battle hangs the fate of our own civilization. Below the climbing fighters, the green patchwork of Kent stretched endlessly, dotted with the white chalk cliffs that had stood sentinel against invaders for centuries. But now the enemy came not by sea, but by air. Wave after wave of Heinkel he won 111 bombers protected by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, their black crosses stark against the summer sky. Flight Lieutenant William Thornfield, flying as Blackwood's wingman, adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his ammunition counter. 8 machine guns loaded with incendiary and armor-piercing rounds, all that stood between the approaching armada and the radar stations, airfields, and cities below. The young pilot from Yorkshire had earned his wings only months before, but his eyes held the steely determination of a veteran warrior. Tally-ho! The cry rang out across the radio as Flight Lieutenant Margaret Sinclair, one of the few women pilots secretly flying combat missions, spotted the enemy formation first. Her modified Hurricane fighter, painted in the distinctive blue-gray camouflage of the Royal Air Force, banged sharply to port as she called out the coordinates. The German formation approached like a great mechanical beast over 300 aircraft strong, their engines creating a symphony of destruction that echoed across the English Channel. Oberst Franz Kellner, leading the bomber stream in his Heinkel, studied the map coordinates one final time. The target, RAF Biggin Hill, the vital fighter command sector station that controlled the aerial defense of southeastern England. Behind him, Hauptmann Erich Steinbock's Messerschmitt fighters wove protective patterns around the bombers, their yellow-nosed aircraft gleaming in the afternoon sun. The German ace had already claimed 12 victories in the campaign, his aircraft decorated with the distinctive dragon emblem that had earned his unit the nickname Dragonstaffel, the Dragon Squadron. As the two forces converged at 20,000 feet above the Garden of England, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Church bells in the villages below had fallen silent, their bronze voices replaced by the growing thunder of approaching engines. Children pressed their faces against cottage windows while their mothers pulled blackout curtains, preparing for what everyone knew would be a battle that would determine the fate of the free world. Blackwood's formation climbed steadily, their Spitfires and Hurricanes arranged in the loose formations that had proven most effective against the German tactics. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutal in their simplicity: fuel, ammunition, and courage against overwhelming numbers. Each British pilot knew that behind them lay London, behind London lay the Empire, and behind the Empire lay the hopes of every free nation still fighting against the spreading darkness of fascism. The distance between the opposing formations shrank with each passing second. At 15,000 feet, the German bombers' aluminum wings caught the sunlight like scales on some mythical beast. At 10,000 feet, individual aircraft became visibly distinctive shapes that pilots had memorized during countless hours of aircraft recognition training. Dragon Knights, Blackwood's voice cut through the static, steady and calm despite the approaching storm. Remember, we are the few upon whom so many depend. Attack. The sky exploded into chaos as the first salvos of machine gun fire painted deadly traces across the azure canvas of the English sky. Blackwood's Spitfire rolled inverted and dove toward the bomber formation, his 8 Browning machine guns hammering out their deadly rhythm. The Hurricane beside him, piloted by squadron leader Patricia Wells, another of the secret female pilots whose existence would remain classified for decades, matched his dive angle perfectly, her guns joining the symphony of destruction. The German bomber formation, flying in their distinctive defensive box pattern, bristled with defensive fire. Dorsal gunners swung their MG-15 machine guns toward the attacking British fighters, their tracer rounds creating a web of death that the RAF pilots had to navigate with split-second timing. The air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and the metallic tang of hot brass shell casings. Hauptmann Steinbock's Messerschmitt fighters swept down from above like hunting falcon, their cannons and machine guns seeking the vulnerable British aircraft. The German ace had studied RAF tactics extensively, and he knew that the key to victory lay in breaking up the British attack before it could reach the bombers. Acting, Spitfires at 2 o'clock high. Steinbock's voice crackled through the German radio network as he rolled his yellow-nosed fighter into a steep climbing turn. His wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, followed closely, the two aircraft moving with the precision of veteran pilots who had flown together since the Polish campaign. The first casualties came swiftly and without ceremony. Flight Sergeant David Morrison's Hurricane, caught in a crossfire between two Messerschmitts, suddenly sprouted flames from its engine cowling. Morrison's voice, calm despite his desperate situation, came through the radio. "Dragon 7 going down. Give them hell for me, lads." The parachute bloomed white against the blue sky as Morrison bailed out, his aircraft spinning earthward in a trail of black smoke. Below, the Home Guard and local constabulary were already moving toward the anticipated crash site, part of the elaborate ground organization that supported the aerial battle. Margaret Sinclair's Hurricane had found its target, a Heinkel 111 that had strayed slightly from the protection of the main formation. Her guns raked the bomber from nose to tail, and she watched with grim satisfaction as the German aircraft's port engine began trailing smoke. The bomber's rear gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, fought back desperately, his machine gun chattering as he tried to drive off the attacking fighter. As documented in the official RAF historical records held at the National Archives in Kew, the battle quickly developed into a swirling melee that stretched across 50 miles of English airspace. Individual combats erupted at every altitude from 5,000 to 30,000 feet, with aircraft diving, climbing, and turning in the deadly dance of aerial warfare. Wing Commander Charles Pemberton, leading a squadron of veteran pilots from RAF North, had positioned his formation to attack the German bombers from the beamer tactic that maximized their firepower while minimizing their exposure to defensive fire. His Spitfire, marked with the distinctive red spinner that identified his aircraft, led the charge against the starboard side of the German formation. The German bomber crews, many of them veterans of the campaigns in Poland, Norway, and France, maintained their formation discipline despite the increasing pressure from the British attacks. Oberst Kellner's voice remained steady on the radio as he coordinated the defensive fire and encouraged his crews to maintain course toward their target. Steady, men. Target in sight. Bomb bay doors opening in 30 seconds. Below them, RAF Biggin Hill's operations room tracked the approaching threat with increasing urgency. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters, led by Section Officer Elizabeth Hartwell, moved the colored blocks across the plotting table with practiced efficiency, their calm professionalism belying the desperate nature of the battle raging overhead. The radar operators, squinting at their cathode ray tube displays, called out vectors and headings to the fighter controllers who directed the scattered British squadrons toward interception points. Every decision made in those underground bunkers would determine whether the vital fighter station would survive the day. The battle reached its crescendo as the German bombers crossed the final miles to their target, their engines straining against the weight of high-explosive bombs that would devastate the vital half fighter station below. Blackwood's ammunition counter showed less than 100 rounds remaining, as he lined up for what he knew would be his final attack run. His Spitfire, scarred by cannon strikes and missing sections of wing fabric, responded sluggishly to his control inputs. Around him, the sky had become a three-dimensional battlefield where death could come from any angle, at any second. "Dragon leader to all aircraft," he transmitted, his voice hoarse from breathing the thin air at altitude. "Final approach. All available aircraft, concentrate on the lead bomber formation. We must break them up before they reach the target." Flight Lieutenant Thornfield's Hurricane had been damaged in his previous attack, his port wing leaking precious fuel that left a visible trail in the cold air. But the young Yorkshire pilot pressed his attack nonetheless, diving toward a Heinkel that had already dropped slightly out of formation, its starboard engine smoking from previous hits. The German bomber's crew fought back with desperate courage. Feldwebel Johann Brenner, the aircraft's pilot, held the controls steady despite the hurricane of machine gun fire that shredded his aircraft's aluminum skin. His bomber, Unteroffizier Fritz Kowalski, crouched over his Lot V7 bomb, calculating the precise moment to release their deadly cargo. Margaret Sinclair had found herself in single combat with Hauptmann, the German ace's yellow-nosed Messerschmitt, twisting and turning in a deadly spiral that carried both aircraft down through the clouds. Her Hurricane, though less maneuverable than the German fighter, compensated with heavier armament and more robust construction. The two aircraft twisted around each other like dancers in some macabre waltz, each pilot seeking the split-second advantage that would mean survival. Steinbock's cannon shells punched holes in Sinclair's port wing, while her return fire shattered his cockpit canopy, filling the German pilot's eyes with fragments of perspective. As referenced in the personal memoirs of Air Chief Marshal Sir Keith Park, published in 1962, the battle's outcome hinged on these crucial moments when individual courage and skill determined the fate of entire squadrons. The British pilots, though outnumbered nearly 4-1, fought with the desperation of men and women defending their homeland. Wing Commander Pemberton's formation had managed to break through the German fighter screen, their concentrated firepower devastating the bomber formation's right flank. His own Spitfire, damaged but still airworthy, pressed the attack against Albert Kellner's lead bomber. The two aircraft locked in a deadly pursuit that stretched across the Kent countryside. The German commander's Heinkel shuddered under the impact of British machine gun fire. its aluminum fuselage punctured in dozens of places. Kellner's navigator, Lieutenant Wilhelm Hartmann, slumped over his charts, wounded by shell fragments that had penetrated the aircraft's thin skin. Bomb release in 10 seconds, Kowalski's voice crackled through the German intercom system, his words nearly drowned by the roar of the Hurricane's Merlin engine, as Thornfield made his final attack run. The young British pilot's guns hammered out their last rounds, the tracers arcing across the narrow gap between the two aircraft. His shots found their mark in the Heinchel's bomb bay, and the result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The German bomber vanished in a brilliant orange fireball that lit up the entire sky, its destruction so complete that no wreckage larger than a man's fist would ever be found. The explosion claimed not only the 5-man German crew but also Thornfield's Hurricane, caught too close to escape the blast. Below, the staff at RAF Beacon Hill watched in awe as the sky above their airfield erupted in flames. The German attack had been broken, but at a cost that would be measured in the lives of Britain's finest pilots. The surviving German bombers, their formation shattered and their fighter escorts scattered, began the long retreat back across the English Channel. But the battle was far from over. The retreat became a running battle that stretched from the smoking skies over Kent to the grey waters of the English Channel, where the surviving German aircraft fled toward the safety of their bases in occupied France. Blackwood's Spitfire, now running on fumes and held together by little more than faith and determination, pursued the remnants of the German bomber formation. His ammunition was exhausted, but his presence alone forced the enemy aircraft to maintain defensive formations that reduced their speed and made them vulnerable to the other RAF fighters still in the hunt. Dragon Leader to all stations, he transmitted, his voice barely audible over the static and the labored breathing of pilots who had pushed themselves and their aircraft to the absolute limit. Hostiles retreating. Maintain pursuit to the coast. Do not let them regroup. Margaret Sinclair's Hurricane bore the scars of her duel with Hauptmann and Steinbock bullet holes stitched across her wings, her cockpit canopy spiderwebbed with cracks, and her port aileron hanging by cables that threatened to snap at any moment. But she had emerged victorious. The German aces Messerschmitt, now a twisted wreck scattered across a Kentish farm field. The wounded German pilot had managed to bail out, his parachute carrying him down toward captivity and medical treatment. Despite the bitter nature of the aerial combat, both sides maintained a grudging respect for enemy pilots who had fought with courage and skill. Squadron Leader Wells, her Hurricane nearly as damaged as Sinclair, had managed to cling to German bombers during the running battle. Her aircraft's fabric covering fluttered in the slipstream, and hydraulic fluid from her damaged landing gear system had created a slick film across her windscreen that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. As documented in the official German Luftwaffe records, captured after the war and now held in the Bundeswehr, the German bomber crews had maintained their discipline and courage even in the face of overwhelming British resistance. Many of the surviving aircraft bore testimony to the fierce fighting engines shot out, control surfaces shredded and crew members wounded or killed at their posts. Oberst Kellner, flying in a replacement aircraft after his command bomber had been destroyed, led the survivors in a desperate dash for the French coast. His formation, which had begun the day with over 200 bombers, now numbered fewer than 60 aircraft still capable of flight. The German fighter escort, led by the surviving pilots of Steinbock's Dragon Squadron, weaved protective patterns around the damaged bombers. Lieutenant Weber, now the unit's senior pilot after his commander's capture, pushed his damaged Messerschmitt to its limits as he tried to shield the vulnerable bombers from the pursuing British fighters. Wing Commander Pemberton's Spitfire had developed a persistent oil leak that coated his windscreen with a brown film, forcing him to fly with his canopy open despite the freezing wind that numbed his face and hands. His formation, reduced to half its original strength, maintained contact with the retreating Germans through sheer determination and the knowledge that every enemy aircraft that escaped would return to fight another day. The pursuit continued across the Channel, where the Royal Navy's destroyers HMS and Valiant had positioned themselves to rescue downed airmen from both sides. The destroyer captains, following the ancient laws of the sea, made no distinction between British and German pilots when it came to saving lives. Flight Lieutenant Patricia Montgomery, flying one of the few remaining Hurricanes still in pursuit, watched her fuel gauge drop toward empty as the French coast appeared on the horizon. Her Equus engine had been running rough since taking cannon fire over Dover, and she knew that every minute of flight time brought her closer to a forced landing in the cold Channel waters. All Dragon Knights, this is Dragon Leader. Blackwood's voice crackled through the radio one final time. Fuel state critical. Break off pursuit and return to base. We've done what we came to do. The surviving British fighters turned back toward England, their engines struggling against the weight of battle damage and the approaching limits of their fuel supplies. Behind them, the remnants of the German formation continued their retreat, their crews sobered by the fierce resistance they had encountered. The green fields of Kent welcomed the returning Dragon Knights with the silence of a battlefield after the storm, where the cost of victory could be measured in empty chairs and vacant dispersal pens. Blackwood's Spitfire touched down at RAF Biggin Hill with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining in its tanks, the engine coughing and sputtering as he taxied toward the dispersal area. The ground crew who ran to meet him stopped in amazement at the sight of his aircraft. Over 200 bullet holes punctured the wings and fuselage. The port wing tip was completely missing, and the cockpit canopy had been shattered by cannon fire. "Bloody hell, sir," muttered leading aircraftman Thompson, the senior mechanic who had maintained Blackwood's aircraft since the beginning of the campaign. "How this old girl stayed in the air is beyond me." The squadron leader climbed stiffly from his cockpit, his leather flying suit soaked with perspiration and his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had sustained him through the 3-hour battle. Around the airfield, the returning aircraft told their own stories. Margaret Sinclair's Hurricane with its port wing held together by cables, squadron leader Wells' aircraft missing its entire rudder assembly, and Wing Commander Pemberton's Spitfire trailing smoke from its overheated engine. The intelligence officers, led by Flight Lieutenant David Harrison, began the grim task of debriefing the surviving pilots. Each account would be carefully recorded, analyzed, and forwarded to Fighter Command Headquarters, where Air Vice Marshal Keith Park would use the information to plan the next day's operations. "Confirmed destroyed?" Harrison asked, his pencil poised over the official forms that would transform the chaos of aerial combat into neat columns of statistics. 17 bombers, 12 fighters, Blackwood replied, his voice hoarse from breathing oxygen at altitude. "But we lost 8 aircraft and 4 pilots. Thornfield, Morrison, Henderson, and Davies won't be coming home." The names would be added to the growing list of casualties that marked the price of Britain's defense. Each pilot represented months of training, thousands of pounds in investment, and irreplaceable experience that could never be recovered. As documented in the personal papers of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, held in the RAF Museum at Hen, the battle had achieved its strategic objective. The German daylight bombing campaign had been blunted, and the Luftwaffe's confidence in their ability to achieve air superiority over Britain had been shaken. Margaret Sinclair sat in the dispersal hut, her hands wrapped around a cup of strong tea that she couldn't seem to warm. The official reports would credit her with 2 confirmed victories and 1 probable, but the young pilot found no satisfaction in the statistics. The image of Hauptmann Steinbock's Messerschmitt spinning earthward in flames would haunt her dreams for years to come. The German prisoners, including Steinbock himself, had been taken to a temporary holding facility, where they would be questioned by intelligence officers before being transferred to permanent prisoner of war camps. The wounded German ace, his left arm in a sling and his face bandaged, maintained the dignity expected of a professional airman, even in defeat. "You fought well today," Steinbock told his interrogator, squadron leader James Mitchell, speaking in heavily accented but precise English. "Your pilots have courage. We did not expect such resistance." Wing Commander Pemberton found himself in the station commander's office, where Group Captain Richard Mallory was already planning the next day's operations. The teletype machines chattered constantly, bringing reports from other fighter stations across southern England and updates on German aircraft movements detected by the radar chain. Mallory asked, his weathered face showing the strain of weeks of continuous combat. "Acceptable, given the results," Pemberton replied, though both men knew that no loss of trained pilots was truly acceptable. When reserves were running dangerously low, the German retreat had been costly for both sides, but the Battle of Britain was far from over. In the operations rooms of the Luftwaffe, German commanders were already planning their next assault, while in the underground bunkers of Fighter Command, British controllers prepared for the battles that would determine the fate of Western civilization. The setting sun painted the English Channel in shades of gold and crimson, illuminating the wreckage of the day's battle that dotted the waters between Dover and Calais, like steel monuments to the courage of those who had fought above. 3 months after the great aerial battle, Squadron Leader Blackwood stood in the cemetery at Biggin Hill, where white headstones marked the graves of those who had fallen in defense of Britain. The inscription on Flight Lieutenant Thornfield's grave reads simply, "He gave his life that others might live free," words that captured the essence of sacrifice made by an entire generation. The Battle of Britain had continued 4 weeks after Eagle Day, but the massive German assault of August 15 had marked a turning point. As Churchill would later write in his memoirs, published in 19, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Margaret Sinclair, now promoted to flight lieutenant and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, had been transferred to a training unit where she would pass on her hard-won experience to the next generation of pilots. Her official records would remain classified for decades, but her contribution to the victory would never be forgotten by those who had fought alongside her. The German air crews who had survived the battle had returned to their bases in France with a new respect for their British opponents. Hauptmann Steinbock, after spending 3 years in a prisoner of war camp, would later write in his memoirs, "We had underestimated the courage and skill of the RAF pilots. They fought like men defending their homes because that is exactly what they were doing." Wing Commander Pemberton had been promoted to group captain and given command of a new fighter wing, but he would never forget the lessons learned in the skies over Kent. The tactics developed during the Battle of Britain would be refined and eventually forming the foundation of Allied air doctrine for the remainder of the war. The radar stations that had given early warning of the German approach continued their vigilant watch, operated by the men and women of the Royal Air Force whose dedication had made victory possible. The technology that had seemed so experimental in 1940 would revolutionize warfare and eventually lead to peacetime applications that would transform the modern world. As documented in the official history of the Royal Air Force, compiled by the Air Historical Branch and published in 1960, the battle had cost the Luftwaffe nearly 2,000 aircraft and experienced aircrew that could never be replaced. The German dream of invading Britain had died in the flames above the English countryside. The surviving aircraft of the Dragon Knights had been repaired and returned to service, their battle scars carefully documented by the ground crews, who took pride in keeping their charges airworthy. Some of these machines would continue fighting until the end of the war, their aluminum skin patched and repatched as they carried new generations of pilots into combat. The women who had fought in secret, pilots like Margaret Sinclair, Squadron Leader Wells, and the others whose existence remained officially denied would wait decades for recognition of their contribution, but their courage had helped turn the tide at Britain's darkest hour, proving that the spirit of resistance knew no boundaries of gender or background. In the German archives, the records of the Dragon Squadron would be preserved as testimony to the skill and courage of pilots who had fought honorably in a dishonorable cause. Many of the surviving German airmen would later express their relief that they had failed, destroy the democratic values that Britain represented. The Battle of Britain had ended not with a single decisive engagement, but with a gradual realization that the cost of achieving air superiority over Britain was too high for the German war machine to bear. The Dragon Knights and their RAF colleagues had won not just a battle, but time for America to join the fight, time for the Soviet Union to mobilize its vast resources, and time for the forces of freedom to gather strength for the long struggle ahead. The legacy of those who fought in the skies over Britain would endure long after the last veteran had passed away, a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when fighting for the things they held most dear.